as Secretary of Defense.
I've made this commitment on behalf of the men and women I'm serving.
I'm not
because
hearing,
it's the most important deployment of my life.
I'm not hearing an answer to my question, so I'm going to move on.
How many push-ups can you do?
I did 5 sets of 47 this morning.
You concerned about retribution, safety?
We stand by our important work and aren't going to be intimidated by the prior and incoming president.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, Pete Hegseth on the Hill. President-elect Trump's pick for defense secretary faces senators and protesters in his high-stakes confirmation hearing.
Admittedly, this nomination is unconventional. The nominee is unconventional. That may be what makes Mr. Hegseth an excellent choice to improve this unacceptable status quo.
Mr. Hegseth, I do not believe that you are qualified to meet the overwhelming demands of this job. We must acknowledge the concerning public reports against you.
What the veteran and former Fox News host had to say about his qualifications, allegations of sexual assault, and plans for the Department of Defense. We're also following the release of Jack Smith's report, what the investigation into President-elect Trump's election interference case found, and why the special counsel says the incoming president would have been convicted for January 6th. Let's start tonight with Nicole Killian on Capitol Hill. Nicole, I know you were in that hearing room following all of this, and you've been covering Hegseth since he was announced as the nominee. I think all of our eyes today, though, were on Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, because she was the most critical when some of these allegations first came out. And we know that Hegseth can only afford to lose, I think, 3 Republicans. I want to play a little bit of what she had to say in her line of questioning.
I want to know, again, let's make it very clear for everyone here today. As Secretary of Defense, will you support women continuing to have the opportunity to serve in combat roles?
Senator, first of all, thank you for your service, as we discussed extensively as well.
It's my privilege.
And my answer is yes, exactly the way that you caveated it. Yes, women will have access to ground combat roles, given the standards remain high.
So, Nicole, what did you make of how Ernst was questioning Hegseth, and what do you make of his chances of making this out of committee?
Yeah, well, it was kind of in line with her line of questioning when she met with Hegseth a few weeks ago. She actually met with him at least 2 times that we are aware of, and was one of those who had kind of held her views about Pete Hegseth, wouldn't really commit one way or the other as to whether or not she would support him. So her line of questioning today was kind of consistent with some of the areas where she has expressed concern, which is she was concerned about, for instance, whether or not the Pentagon would submit to a clean audit or when it would finally get a clean audit. That's been kind of a big sticking point for her. So she raised that in today's hearing, but had previously raised it in meetings with Hegseth. And then, as you heard there in that soundbite, she again asked him about his views about women serving in combat in the military. And she also asked about whether or not he would commit to addressing sexual assault within the military by naming an additional official, to oversee that. So those were all concerns that she had raised prior to the hearing that she reiterated during the hearing. So we didn't necessarily hear anything new from the senator. However, I would point out that she did make clear to me when I asked her about whether the committee should hear from that accuser. Take a listen to what she told me earlier today.
Get some clarity around Pete Hegseth's accuser. Did somebody from the accuser, do you want to hear from the accuser, Senator? I know this is a very important issue to you. Do you want to hear from the accuser?
We'll visit after the hearing.
And did someone reach out to your office, Senator? Yes or no? Did someone reach out to your office? I have not spoken to you.
And so part of the reason I asked her about that is because, Hegseth submitted to an FBI background check. And from our understanding, according to several senators on the Senate Armed Services Committee, not all of them had access to those findings. Furthermore, some said that it was not as complete as they thought it should be. Now, that's mostly Democrats on the panel who said that, but they did acknowledge, to the best of their understanding, that it did not include an interview with that accuser with respect to the incident back in 2017 at a California hotel, nor did it include any interviews with Hegseth's ex-wives. So that is something that some lawmakers were looking for, and also given Senator Ernst's views around sexual assault, that's kind of why I pressed her about whether she felt it was important to hear from that accuser. That being said, we don't anticipate that accuser to come forward at this time, and most senators coming out of the hearing today seem to feel relatively satisfied with the way the hearing went, the amount of information that was provided, although that was mostly from the Republican side of the aisle. Many Democrats feel that they still have more questions after today's hearing.
All right, Nicole Killian on the Hill with those tough questions. Thank you for following it all for us. We appreciate it. And Katrina Kaufman and Finn Gomez join us now to unpack some more of this. Guys, thanks for being here. Katrina, I want to start with you because we heard from lots of Democrats on this panel who are trying to kind of push this case against Hegseth. I want to play a little bit of what Mazie Hirono, who's a senator from Hawaii, had to say.
Then President Trump directed former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper to shoot protesters in the legs in downtown D.C., an order Secretary Esper refused to comply with. Would you carry out such an order from President Trump?
Senator, I was in the Washington, D.C. National Guard unit that was in Lafayette Square during those
events. Would you carry out an order to shoot protesters in the legs?
I saw 50 Secret Service agents get injured by rioters trying to jump over the fence, set the church on fire, and destroy a statue.
That sounds to me that you will comply with such an order.
So what does that exchange suggest or signal about how Hegseth may be different from past secretaries of defense?
So during this questioning, it just really felt evident that Hegseth is not going to push back on orders from Donald Trump. As we just saw in that clip, another question she asked him is what he would do if Trump asked him to take Greenland or the Panama Canal, which are things that we've heard Trump talking about lately. And Hegseth refused to answer that, too. He said that he wasn't going to make a statement either way in this public forum. So that would be a real contrast from Mark Esper, for example, who, when Trump wanted him to put active duty troops on the streets at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, he pushed back against that, ultimately to his detriment. But it doesn't seem like Hegseth would really be counter to things that Trump asked him to do.
I mean, speaking of Trump, so obviously the audience is the senators who are asking these questions and Hegseth answering, the American people who can see this for themselves, but Donald Trump also is a target member of the audience here. I know you've been talking to people inside Trump's circle. What are they saying about how and whether he watched it and kind of what his takeaways were?
Well, I think the number one viewer, the most important viewer for Pete Hegseth and his entourage there was Donald Trump. And a senior advisor to Trump tells me that he did watch at least part of it, and he said he was very happy. The president-elect was very happy with how well he did today. I spoke to another advisor who said he crushed it, deflated the Dems, set the tone for the rest of the nominees. Democrats have nothing, and that he was excellent, proved why Trump chose him. Obviously, you see this praise coming from Mar-a-Lago, from West Palm Beach, on how well he did. And just if you remember, just about a month ago, his nomination was in trouble. I mean, there were people lining up to potentially replace him, including Ron DeSantis. And now it feels like we're in a different place now.
Yeah, kind of a comeback story of his own so far as this hearing goes. Katrina, did we learn anything about kind of what Hegseth's vision is for the Department of Defense and the military? Yeah,
he spoke at the opening about how he wants to foster a warrior culture, to rebuild the military, to establish more deterrence. Something he's talked about a lot is he wants to eliminate diversity and inclusion policies. He has talked about really just firing top senior leadership, especially people who have been involved in DEI and in the withdrawal from Afghanistan as well. So he says he wants to get rid of wokeness in the military.
Yeah, that was a line of questioning from nearly every Republican senator here, so kind of pushing that message. I mean, it seemed to me, Finn, that Hegseth will likely get confirmed. I mean, even Joni Ernst, who Nicole talked about there, started off her questioning by submitting a record of a very complimentary letter from an Iowa National Guardsman. And so it seems like a lot of today, as you mentioned, Hegseth was kind of left for dead a month ago, seems to be perhaps a foreshadowing of some of these other nominees. Is that kind of how Trump sees it, that this is opening the door for others to get confirmed?
Yeah, I think so. And in speaking with both Republicans and Democrats, they were looking at Ernst. They were looking at Ernst and see what her reaction would be, because they felt that his candidacy, his nomination really hinged on her reaction, right? With some of these very troubling allegations that we have heard and that had been reported earlier, late last year. But now with his, how well the Trump did and how she reacted, I feel that again that he's in there's a different trajectory now with Hegseth, and it does, we have to see the vote, we have to see it go through the committee, but how it does feel that like the tenor has changed for Hegseth's nomination.
Yeah, I mean, he can only afford to lose 3 senators. Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins aren't kind of beholden to that same Trump base the way that some of these others were. But it was just so notable to me that Roger Wicker, the chairman of the committee, came out and called it a triumph. And I think that kind of tells us everything we need to know about how Republicans at least are seeing it, and they're targeting Republicans.
Sure.
I want to switch gears a little bit, Finn, because I know you have some new reporting on some high-profile guests who will be at inauguration in just a few days.
Right, we're just a few days away from inauguration, but CBS News has learned that Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg are expected to attend the inauguration on the 20th. And of course, all 3 have donated to the inauguration committee, as we know. They're also the 3 richest people on Earth, according to Forbes, an estimated worth of $850 billion combined. But of course, this is something new. We have not seen this sort of presence prior in recent inaugurations, and it also says a lot about their potential influence that they will carry this incoming administration.
Yeah, I mean, several tech leaders, including all of those there. I mean, Elon Musk has basically moved into Mar-a-Lago, but several others have come to meet with Donald Trump in West Palm Beach. I know we have all spent a lot of time there following them. I mean, Katrina, just quickly, this seems to be kind of a sign of big tech coming back, yet another sign, I should say, of big tech, really firmly behind Trump.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not surprising that they're coming. We've been seeing them, as you said. Elon Musk is basically living at Mar-a-Lago. Mark Zuckerberg is conferring with Trump before people on his own board about his content moderation policies. So I think this may be signs of what's to come.
Yeah, great.
Definite shift.
Yeah, absolutely. Something to watch in this new Congress as well. Finn and Katrina, thank you very much for your reporting. We appreciate it. And ahead tonight, dangerous winds return to Los Angeles, the extreme weather warning and fears that it could fan the flames. Plus, the Justice Department releases a portion of former special counsel Jack Smith's report, what it says about President-elect Trump's role in the Capitol riot. You're watching America Decides. And welcome back to America Decides. Special counsel Jack Smith says President-elect Trump would have been convicted if he hadn't won the presidential race. He lays out the evidence to back up this claim, this in his final report on the 2020 election interference case. Smith also alleges Trump blasted key witnesses and prosecutors during the investigation, provoking his followers to go after them. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarlane and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree join us now. Gentlemen, great to see you. I know you've both been following this for nearly 2 years now, so we finally have at least a conclusion of this portion. Tom, I'm wondering what your main takeaways are.
Well, my main takeaway was Jack Smith was pretty clearly writing for history. I think in his view, he was ideally going to be writing for a court or speaking to a jury or presenting his case in a court of law. That's never going to happen. And I think he realized that. And so what he was doing was basically putting forth, committing to writing, committing to the annals of history, the evidence he uncovered. And then to your point, he also reaffirmed his belief that the evidence that he and his team had amassed would have been sufficient to convict President Trump. So I think he was telling the public, I wasn't able to bring my case, but if I had been, I would have won it.
Okay, so this is what my first question was. As an attorney yourself, how much of that, too, is, of course, he figured that he could get a conviction here. Otherwise, he wouldn't have brought it. I mean, he mentioned in these pages, too, that they didn't bring the insurrection.
Well, and that would have been the real news if he had said, you know something, I don't think I would have won this case, right? In other words, to your point, if he didn't think he could win the case, he had no business bringing it in the first place. So, of course, it was redundant, unnecessary. But I think he wanted to signal to the American people that, you know, notwithstanding the outcome of the election, he, Jack Smith, believed that he had a winning hand here to play.
Yeah, and how significant it was that Trump won the election. Scott, to Tom's point, in the report, I want to pull up some of this here. In the report, Smith writes that, quote, after Mr. Trump publicly assailed these individuals, threats and harassment from his followers inevitably followed. I know you've been covering a lot about threats to lawmakers and public officials. I mean, this seems to stand out here.
It's a 137-page report, and you're showing page 112, which just jumped out of the report to a lot of us, because not only is Jack Smith articulating the experience of witnesses, investigators, prosecutors, and even the judge in this case. They were all menaced, all harassed, all threatened. But he seems to be making a broader statement of this is where we are right now. Those who defy President Trump and who are called out publicly by President-elect Trump are going to be subjected to menacing, harassment, and threats. That is a bigger picture issue, which we brought to some of the former investigators with the House January 6th Select Committee. We asked them, was this your reality? Are you concerned moving forward? Pete Aguilar, the California Democrat, says, yes, we will not be intimidated, but yes, that has been the experience of those who investigate. Then Benny Thompson, who was the chairman of the House January 6th Select Committee of Mississippi, told CBS News today he would accept a pardon if President Biden offered it because he's concerned of what Donald Trump will do next because of the investigation. Take a listen to more of Benny Thompson speaking to CBS News.
I'm from a part of the country where speaking your opinion used to cost you your life. When I hear someone about to be sworn into the presidents of the United States say he wants to lock you up for doing your job, I believe him. And so if for Benny Thompson that is something that's offered to me, I will accept it.
Caitlin, the clock ran out on Jack Smith. He's trying to make that case pretty clearly in his report. I think one of the things investigators would tell us if we asked them why the clock ran out, one of the reasons is because so many threats, so much harassment, it did slow down the process of getting witnesses.
To that point, I mean, this talk about pardons or preemptive pardons, if they do come, I mean, Tom, should those involved here in this report, Jack Smith and others, be concerned about any sort of retribution from this incoming Justice Department?
Well, I think they should be concerned. I mean, certainly the president-elect has made no secret that he intends to, at a minimum, suggest or even direct that these people be investigated and potentially prosecuted. I mean, he's been very upfront about that. To my mind, the real question is, what do the people running DOJ actually do? And it's one thing for the president to say these people should be investigated, these people should be held accountable. It's quite another thing for the head of the Justice Department or a senior official in the Justice Department to make a prosecutorial decision that there's an evidentiary basis to bring criminal charges and to bring that prosecution. That's where the rubber hits the road. And so I think it is going to be very interesting seeing what happens in the months ahead, because we know there's going to be presidential pressure, to say the least, applied to these people, whether or not they are faithful to the law, faithful to the evidence, and only make those prosecutorial calls that are justifiable.
Go ahead.
It's one thing that Tom raises, I think it's especially important in this context. You know, the prosecutors who brought this case, they're going to face the fear of retribution. But when they landed this report, when they submitted this thing and it was finally released overnight, that was the last step of this historic investigation they were part of, this prosecution of a former president for trying to overturn the election results. There will be no prosecution now. How many Americans, what subset of Americans are dissatisfied with how this final chapter played out with an overnight release of a 137-page white paper on an obscure government website? This is not the final step many people envisioned, and we'll see how that lands politically over the next few years.
Well, I'm curious kind of along those lines. I mean, we know that Trump won't be convicted here or prosecuted any further, but what about some of the co-conspirators named, Rudy Giuliani, others? I mean, I would assume the next Justice Department, to your point, wouldn't take that up.
Well, I mean, those cases, at least for now, will survive and move ahead. But, of course, there's going to be a new sheriff in town as of noon on January 20th. And I suspect that one of the first things that the new Justice Department leadership will do is reevaluate whether or not they want to continue existing kind of Biden-era prosecutions or whether they want to drop them. So I think that will be yet another litmus test of kind of where this administration is going in terms of the administration of justice, whether or not they continue some of these prosecutions or whether they bring them to an end.
And, of course, Attorney General nominee Pam Bondi her hearing is tomorrow. And then, Scott, just quickly, this was one part of this investigation. There was another investigation by Jack Smith into the classified documents case. Will we ever see that?
It's possible this gets released to Congress, and that's a leaky ship if there ever was one Congress. It's also possible the litigation results in a judge finally allowing that report to be released if those co-defendants in Florida have their cases dismissed.
All right, well, Scott and Tom, an end of an era, and we'll see about that part as well. Thank you both so much for your time and analysis and reporting over the past 2 years. We appreciate it. And another fire erupts near Los Angeles as firefighters battle another round of extremely high winds. The latest from California is next on America Decides.
We will work together to ensure that we drive the resources necessary to help the rebuilding effort that Southern California needs. This is not a time for partisanship or division. It's a time to come together.
That was California Democratic Congressman Pete Aguilar as his state grapples with the devastating impact of the deadly wildfires. Officials are now dealing with strengthening winds as the fires continue to burn. The death toll stands at 24. CBS News correspondent Adam Yamaguchi is in Pacific Palisades. Adam, what more can you tell us?
It's impossible to describe the enormity of the destruction that we're seeing all around us here. You know, scenes like this play out over and over and over again. When you think you've seen the end of the line, you turn the bend and you discover an entire block, entire neighborhood that has suffered the exact same fate. There's an eeriness here. It's so quiet. All you can really hear are the birds chirping, the wind rustling leaves, and the occasional helicopter that interrupts that silence. The authorities have just started day one of the search for remains of those who may be left behind here. So the numbers of dead is only expected to increase here. Residents are still under mandatory evacuations. They haven't been back yet. They probably won't be back for a few more days because there are still many, many hazards here. The air is extremely heavy. You can feel it in your lungs just after a few minutes. There are toxins not just in the air, but in the ground. We've seen a number of down power lines. You see lines strewn about. And even though they've been discharged, some of these lines may actually still hold some charge. So it's going to be a minute before people are back. And when they do come back, residents are going to discover the true magnitude of what's been lost. Homes, all their properties, and a lifetime of memories that have been eviscerated.
Adam Yamaguchi, thank you for that report.
We have seen multiple names of colleagues consistently throughout your career that have talked about your abusive actions.
Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth is grilled over sexual assault and misconduct. We'll take a closer look at those allegations. And while Hegseth was on Capitol Hill, service members were being put through their own paces down on Pennsylvania Avenue. With just 6 days until President-elect Trump's inauguration, it was rehearsal day in the nation's capital. You're watching America Decides.
Let's get into this allegation about sexual assault, inappropriate workplace behavior, alcohol abuse, and financial mismanagement during your time as a nonprofit executive.
A small handful of anonymous sources were allowed to drive a smear campaign, an agenda about me, because our left-wing media in America today, sadly, doesn't care about the truth. All they were out to do, Mr. Chairman, was to destroy me.
That was Pete Hegseth on Capitol Hill today, fielding a question about misconduct allegations reported after President-elect Trump announced him as the pick to lead the Department of Defense. Let's bring in our reporter panel for today. Say that 3 times fast. To further discuss today's confirmation hearing and more, we have Evan McMorris-Santoro, who is a reporter for Notice, and Andrew Desiderio, who is a senior congressional reporter for Punchbowl News. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here. Evan, I want to start with you because we saw today a little bit in that exchange that you just heard that Hegseth was emphatically denying these accusations against him. Specifically, they are tied to his previous work with 2 veterans nonprofit groups, calling the reporting a smear campaign. That seemed indicative, or at least the Republican responses to him seemed indicative that they are trying to get to yes here. What was your takeaway?
Well, folks like me were watching, not from the Capitol where Andrew is, but, in our houses where I am right now. And what you saw was really this kind of version of a TV show that we've seen many times before now, which is that you have a lot of allegations that come forward, some of them credible, they've been around for a while, and then you see this fight about the media that arrives, and this idea that, like, I'm being smeared, I'm being attacked. This has been a very successful way of thinking and way of approaching these kinds of allegations that we've seen in past confirmation hearings. And I think you're right. From what we saw from senators today, the Republican senators, that Mr. Hegseth needs to get this job, that it does seem to be working. I would say that, in the early days of this nomination, there were some thoughts that this might be a really tough one. He's kind of an unknown quantity to a lot of people in the defense industry. But as he now has emerged as kind of like a MAGA mascot, a person now with this, I'm persecuted by the media, there's a lot of ways now the Republican senators can get to yes on him. I think they're going to do it.
Yeah, and Andrew, you're up on Capitol Hill. I know you've been following all this, covering the Senate very closely. So you have the senators in this committee who will have to vote him out of the committee, and then it obviously goes to the full Senate. We talk a lot about how Republicans have control over the Senate, but their majority isn't, that much. I'm curious what your sense from your reporting, is interesting how Ernst seemed to more inclined to Hegseth there. Do you have any sense of how other senators who may be on the fence might be inclined to actually support him?
Well, the perpetual swing votes, as we call them, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, for example, are not quite commenting yet on what they thought of the hearing, number one, and number two, how they'll vote on Pete Hegseth. But Republican leaders expressed a level of confidence today that he will be able to overcome those hurdles. As you mentioned, the committee has to hold a vote on him. They'll do that on Monday, which is Inauguration Day, of course. They'll do that later in the afternoon. At that point, the Senate Majority Leader John Thune can move to tee up that nomination on the Senate floor pretty much immediately. And we don't expect cooperation from Democrats, of course, on getting that floor process done quickly. So it'll take a few days. But if Republicans are prioritizing national security nominations like they say they are, then Pete Hegseth's would be an obvious choice. Again, of course, assuming that he has the votes. As you noted, Republicans have a pretty slim majority here. They've got 53 votes. So that means that Hegseth can only lose 3 Republicans maximum before he's in very dangerous territory.
And Andrew, I want to play a little bit of what we heard from the hearing. Here's a Q&A between Hegseth and Senator Shaheen of New Hampshire. Let's take a listen.
Why should women in our military, if you were the Secretary of Defense, believe that they would have a fair shot and an equal opportunity to rise through the ranks? If on the one hand, you say that women are not competent, they make our military less effective, and on the other hand, you say, oh no, now that I've been nominated to be the Secretary of Defense, I've changed my view on women in the military.
Senator, I would say I would be honored to have the opportunity to serve alongside you, shoulder to shoulder, men and women, black, white, all backgrounds, with a shared purpose.
So this was a theme in several questioners, and you obviously had two veterans who were women on that committee as well. Andrew, I'm curious about, what we learned in terms of Hegseth's responses there. Did they satisfy those members on the committee?
Well, Senator Shaheen, who you just played there, characterized it as, quote, an 11th hour conversion. Obviously, as you noted, Senator Joni Ernst, Senator Tammy Duckworth are two female combat veterans who sit on that committee. The issue of women serving in combat roles in the military has been a perpetual sort of policy debate within that committee as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the big piece of legislation that this committee is responsible for passing every single year. But I think it was most important that Senator Ernst, in particular, who's a Republican, expressed a level of satisfaction with Pete Hegseth's responses when it comes to this, because based on her questions and the way she responded after Pete Hegseth, talked about this issue and then proceeded to promise to appoint a senior official within DoD leadership to address sexual assault, which is another issue that Senator Ernst cares a lot about. She appeared to be satisfied with those responses. So I think that virtually guarantees that Pete Hegseth will clear that key hurdle on Monday, the getting out of committee. Again, it's still an open question right now as to whether he'll have enough votes on the floor to get confirmed. But as I mentioned before, Republican leaders seem pretty confident right now that he will get the requisite votes.
Yeah, the chairman of that committee calling it a triumph at the end. Evan, I want to ask you about some of these other confirmation hearings coming this week, because you have Hegseth today, who's among the more controversial picks. But tomorrow you're going to have Senator Marco Rubio, who's up for Secretary of State. I mean, that seems like a layup here. What should we expect?
Yeah, I mean, it does help to be a sitting senator to go before other senators to be confirmed. It's a nice way of doing it. But, we've had a lot of good reporting about this in Notice, on notice.org. My colleague, Haley Bird-Wild, has written a lot of great stories about Rubio's nomination. And, Rubio represents an interesting move, especially when you compare these two nominees that we're talking about. Hegseth is sort of really embodies the kind of changes to conservatism that some in the MAGA movement really want to see happen with Trump coming in. Whereas Rubio is seen as, by many in the sort of, foreign policy mainstream as a guy they can work with, a guy that they've thought about before and, maybe respect and respect his positions. This is a different kind of nomination than the Hegseth nomination. And I do think that based on what we've seen so far, he's going to have an easier time of it. The question for him really comes when he gets into the administration, and he may find himself clashing with some of the points of view that come from guys like Hegseth when it comes to foreign policy positions, and how that's all going to play out. But I do think he's on a smoother path than some other nominees.
Yeah, that's a fascinating dynamic to watch as we go forward, and also tomorrow will be interesting to see as kind of the bookend to a very interesting relationship that, of course, that Marco Rubio has had with Donald Trump. So we shall stay tuned, and I know you both will be covering it all for us. Evan and Andrew, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And President Barack Obama lifted it. Donald Trump reinstated it. And now outgoing President Joe Biden is planning to lift the U.S. designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Cuba was included on the blacklist as one of the last policy decisions made by the Trump administration in 2020. The Trump White House cited Cuba's harboring of Colombian terrorists and Americans fleeing justice for the designation. Removing Cuba from the list could lead to the lifting of sanctions. Currently, only 3 other countries are designated as state sponsors of terrorism: Iran, North Korea, and Syria.
The ball is now in Hamas's court. If Hamas accepts, the deal is ready to be concluded and implemented.
Renewed hope for a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, what we know about the plan to stop the fighting, and the release of the October 7th hostages. You're watching America Decides. We're following developing news out of the Middle East tonight. Sources tell CBS News that both Israel and Hamas have agreed in principle to a ceasefire and hostage deal. CBS News foreign correspondent Rami Inocencio is in Tel Aviv with more.
CBS News has learned from U.S., Israeli, and Arab officials that the draft for a ceasefire and hostage deal has been agreed to in principle. And if it all carries on smoothly, then Israel and Hamas will finalize it this week. Today, an Israeli government official here in Tel Aviv who wants to be anonymous told us the outlines of that deal. In phase one, Hamas would release 33 hostages made up of women, the elderly, the sick, and some children in exchange for a higher number of Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons. As for Israel's military presence in Gaza, that official said that assets, which we're understanding to mean military assets, would remain in Gaza, and that the IDF would establish a security buffer zone between southern Gaza and Israel. And as for the people of Gaza, humanitarian aid, which we know is so desperately needed now, especially at the height of winter, would be surged. The latest number we have on the death toll is over 46,500 people. That just crossed the 46,000 mark only last week. Pushing ahead to phase two, talks on that would start during phase one, and with the goal of releasing younger hostages and Israeli soldiers. But first, of course, phase one has to be agreed. If it does, implementation could start this weekend with hostages starting to be released. The last time that happened was more than a year ago, but a reminder, we have been here before many times. Talks could collapse at any minute. Many are cynical, but again, one more time, there is that feeling of hope, and that official says in large part because of the U.S. and the double backing of the outgoing Biden White House and the incoming Trump White House. Back to you.
Ramy Inocencio, thank you. CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd joins us now for some analysis. Sam, great to see you. So we've been reporting for months now of these stalled negotiations and that they could be on the horizon here. But I'm curious, what happened in Qatar to actually get to where we stand today?
Well, there certainly is a sense of deja vu as we hope that we're on a precipice of a ceasefire and hostage release negotiation. I think certain factors have materially changed. In the first instance, Bibi Netanyahu has had more time to try to accomplish his military objectives in Gaza. Previously, a sticking point has been Bibi Netanyahu insisting on the complete decimation of Hamas, while the U.S. administration has pointed out their view that he had accomplished his military objectives there. There was a difference there. Further, Hamas has been very focused on ensuring that Israel withdraws from some key strategic areas known as the Philadelphia corridor and some other buffer zones in parts of Gaza. Israel now seems to have backed off their insistence regarding those territories, likely again because Netanyahu feels that he's accomplished more of his military objectives. Netanyahu is under even more increased pressure domestically, and we do have the Trump factor here. I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu makes decisions solely based on what Donald Trump has to say, but Donald Trump has been pressuring Netanyahu both directly and through his Middle East envoy to be Steve Witkoff to make a deal. And, you know, the Middle East peace is one area that Biden and Netanyahu agree on. And so their two envoys, Brett McGurk and Steve Witkoff, have been working in very close concert to try to get this job done.
Yeah, it's really notable how well those teams have been working together. I mean, Steve Witkoff has, commended the Biden administration for how they're including them in these negotiations. You heard Ramy kind of lay out these three different stages of this plan. I'm wondering what your biggest takeaways are.
Well, if history is prologue, we know that phase one, hopefully we get to phase one and we see the release of 33 Israeli hostages, including women and children, as well as other male hostages at some juncture. But if we can just get to phase one, that is a major accomplishment, both in terms of the Israeli hostages and in terms of allowing more aid in. That is part of the phase one agreement. However, the last time we were here, we got through phase one and never got to a phase two. And so it is quite possible that we do see a hostage release, prisoner release, additional aid in for some period of weeks, and other conditions under phase one, but never get to a phase two. But even that would be an improvement upon where we are today, as the people of Gaza are starving and Israeli hostages have been in captivity for just far too long.
And since we seem to be closer to a deal than we ever have before, I'm wondering what kinds of things you're looking at that could derail this altogether.
Well, I think it is clear an important factor here on the Israeli side is that this is not a deal that President-elect Trump would pull back from once inaugurated on Monday. So the Israelis know that they would have both the Biden administration support and President-elect Trump support. What could derail this deal is if the ceasefire that is supposed to be in effect for 6 weeks in phase one is derailed by either Hamas or other terrorist group action against Israel during this 6 week period, or if Israel launches military incursions into Gaza, or if humanitarian assistance is not allowed in to the degree that Israel pledges it would. So there are a lot of factors that could throw this off, but importantly, in the very first days of this deal, we would already see hostages released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. So even that would be an improvement from an Israeli perspective from where we are today. And hopefully more aid would get in very quickly as well to help the people of Gaza.
Yes, we are all hoping for some kind of deal to go through. Sam Vinograd, thank you as always for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And he's the longtime head of the Democratic Party in former VP candidate Tim Walz's home state of Minnesota. Now, Ken Martin says he's ready for the national stage. We're tracking the DNC chair race next on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. One candidate for Democratic National Committee chair is rapidly building support with just a handful of weeks left to go until that election. Ken Martin, who leads the Minnesota Democrats, his campaign revealed to CBS News that he's secured 51 endorsements from current state party and vice chairs. That brings his total number of public endorsements from voting members to 86. The DNC chair election is scheduled for February 1st. That's less than 3 weeks from today. Hunter Woodall has been following this race very closely for us and is here now. Hunter, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So we're talking about Ken Martin. Kind of put into context for us how many endorsements he has, what this means in the bigger context of whether he can move forward.
You hear so much about endorsements and how much they matter. Any political reporter knows that, right? But this DNC chairs race, there's only, I was checking my numbers here, there's only about 450 or so members that can actually vote in this contest. So this is a very small pool of people actually deciding the next Democratic National Committee chair. I've covered state house primaries in Kansas that have more voters than this. And that's just the thing here. With what Ken Martin has been able to do, that's a sizable share of endorsements at this stage. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but this tells us he obviously is building support from state chairs like himself.
And does this mean that he's the front runner? Kind of who else is running in this race? What can we kind of expect? Who else is kind of thought of as potential contenders?
Well, the other prominent name here is Ben Wickler, the Wisconsin Democratic Party chair. He's well known. He does a lot of media. Obviously represented Democrats in a key presidential battleground state, but also one where Democrats obviously have struggled, especially in this last cycle. So there's that interesting give and take of okay, you represent a swing state, you represent a battleground state, but Democrats lost there more or less. Obviously they won the Senate race, but they lost the presidential race there just a few months ago.
Yeah, speaking of that, Democrats are kind of in the wilderness right now. I think the biggest question for Democrats this year is what does the party look like? What kind of message are they unifying behind? Does this race give us any sense of kind of some of the themes that Democrats are weighing?
Well, what's so clear is this kind of shock, hurt, and really introspection. Okay, they lost big time. They know they lost big. The awkwardness here is you're running to become the leader of this party, and you're having to go to a lot of folks who helped this loss happen and say, hey, I want to lead you now. So it's a very interesting thing. You're having to kind of delicately make this case of if you're a Democrat, hey, we want change, but how much change do we really want to make? And especially in a race like this, Democratic delegates from Wyoming had the same votes as somebody from Pennsylvania. So you're having to appeal to a really broad coalition to win this race. And that's, was the interesting tension here so far.
Yeah, well, a tough job for whoever wins this race. We'll know in a few weeks now. Hunter, thank you so much for covering it all for us. We appreciate it. That does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.